Welcome everyone. This is the nation-state actor shoes, a look from the other side of the fence, and I am Anastasios. Before I start, a big disclaimer that everything I'm going to be talking about today is my personal research and my personal views. It doesn't represent my employer by any means. And hopefully that will be clear as I'm going through the presentation. The goal of this talk is to make all of us better threat researchers by improving how we see the other side of the fence. Typically, this is called red team thinking, which is thinking like the adversary, but the whole theme of my talk is to better understand how nation-state actors operate. Now on why me? The simpler question compared to what I have here would be the people that have the really in-depth knowledge and experience in this space are not allowed to talk about it. And in my case, because of this background and especially my interest in espionage history, allowed me to talk with some of these people. And lately, we also had a lot of leaked content from different agencies around the world. So all of that combined was the sources that result in the presentation I'm going through today. The agenda is pretty simple. First of all, I will start with the signals intelligence to make sure that we all speak the same language. And then I'm going to talk about two specific use cases, looking at them from the nation-state actor perspective. The first one is what happens when certain tools get leaked or threat research is published. And the second part is when we're talking about attribution, it is kind of different if you are a nation-state actor versus a cybersecurity company. And I'm going to go into depth in that space, but to give you an idea, if you are officially as a country saying that another country did some sort of cyber activity against your nation, you have to be way more certain than an attribution that will be used in a less critical manner. So let's start with SIGINT, or Signals Intelligence. SIGINT has two components. The first one is the ELINT. We're not going to touch anything in this space, this is only for awareness, but ELINT is information derived primarily from electronic signals that do not contain speech or text. Typically here we're talking about intercepting like the signals that radars produce, certain kinds of weapons, and so on. This is beyond our scope in this presentation. However, the second part of SIGINT is the COMINT, which is Communications Intelligence. In this case, what we are after is any sort of intelligence that has to do with speech, text, or general communication. And of course, cyber activity falls under that since we use the cyberspace to communicate, whether this is systems communicating to each other or people communicating, all of that falls under COMINT, which eventually falls under SIGINT. And this is why you see SIGINT agencies doing all of the cyber operations. Now, how does it work from a very, very high level? In every country, you have some head of state, and if you have multiple agencies doing signals intelligence, you might even have copies of what I'm talking about here in different sectors. For example, you might have a separate organization for military intelligence, a separate one for foreign intelligence, and so on. But those key stakeholders are going to be defining what are the national security policies. And what do I mean by this one is, okay, who do we consider to be our enemy, our ally, and the countries in between? And those are going to drive the SIGINT organization on their objectives and prioritization. What the SIGINT organization is going to do is take those and translate them to PIRs, to priority intelligence requirements. For example, for the enemies, it could be we want to know everything about them. For the allies, it could be, okay, we might want to validate that one thing or two that they have said if it's actually true. And for those nations in between, it might be, well, we don't really trust them, so we need to keep an eye on everything they're doing that might have a relation to our goals. In practice, this translates to SIR, Specific Information Requirements, which is what are the specific pieces of information we need to answer those priority intelligence requirements. And all of that goes into the organization departments that mainly consist of the collection, analysis and production, and dissemination. Something that happens in this stage is that throughout all of this process, there might be certain things that happen that need additional information. Those are typically referred to as the EEIs, or Essential Elements of Information. and those are for events of interest. Let's say, for example, that a foreign nation is going to have some elections recently, and that is something that the heads of state are very interested in, but we don't have this information. After all of that is done and the analysis is produced, then the dissemination happens back with the stakeholders, and this is a continuous cycle that goes back. This is not the traditional intelligence cycle, but I intentionally did not include the intelligence cycle here because I want to be more practical on how things work. Now, there is a difference between signals intelligence and counterintelligence, or CI. Those are very important to understand to have a better view of those organizations and how they operate. In the intelligence side, how do you fulfill those PIRs is by collecting that information or simply stealing it from whoever had access to those SIRs and EIs. The second part is you analyze all the available sources and then you produce reports, which nowadays it could be anything. It could be actually reports, printed reports, electronic reports, live dashboards that continuously update, podcasts, videos, anything you can imagine. But you produce an answer to those intelligence requirements and you share it back to your customers. And that could be, for example, what are the plans of country X with regards to this, let's say, weapons deal. Now, the second part, which is very critical, equally critical, is the counterintelligence. Here is what do the adversaries do? How are they attacking our nation in this case? Also, if we are doing those operations for intelligence collection, to monitor that they haven't been compromised. For example, to monitor that no one has detected them, to monitor that no one managed to steal the tools that they are using. And finally, to find out who is spying back on you. In the cyberspace, we focus a lot on the counterintelligence, but we also need to not forget about the intelligence collection. Hopefully, that clarifies all of the general terminology and SIGINT organizations. And the next slide, I'm going to be talking about what I have seen from all of the different intelligence agencies I have studied so far in terms of the structures. And I categorize them to three very, very broad categories. The first one is countries that have very limited cyber SIGINT capabilities. We're talking about agencies that have anything from 0 to 10 people. Typically, they don't operate in 24/7, but they might have some shift work if they are running some cyber operation that requires around-the-clock operations. Because of that, those countries typically have very limited technical expertise. And for this reason, they cannot rely on in-house capabilities like building their own tools, their own implants, their own exploits, and so on. So they rely heavily on third parties, that is, companies that produce and sell those products only to government agencies. And you might have heard of some of them in the news. I'm not going to name any companies over here, there are dozens of these companies. But they also rely a lot on allied agencies. What I mean here is that Nation A might have very good relationships with Nation B, and they know that Nation B is in a more mature state, so they ask them to perform some of these operations or provide them with the tooling or expertise to do it on their own. Then we go to the more of a basic SIGINT function countries, and this is the majority of the countries that exist today, where you have a couple of dozen of people dedicated to cyber signals intelligence. This one has pros and cons, as you can imagine. Typically in those countries, they have some form of shift work for 24/7 coverage, and from one country to another varies a lot in technical expertise. There are some countries that although they have small teams, they are building exceptionally good tooling and general capabilities, but there are others that are more leaning towards the first model, where the teams are mostly on the operator side and less on the engineering side. The good thing on this kind of size for these organizations is that they are very agile and very flexible, and that is easy to imagine. You can literally have the entire cyber signals intelligence team sitting in a meeting room, agreeing on something and executing it. For this reason, they are moving faster, and sometimes they are more efficient than the larger organizations. Typically, in terms of tooling and capabilities, they have this hybrid format that for certain things they might build them in-house. for certain tooling or capabilities. For example, they might have some really good malware analysts or reverse engineers or exploit developers, and they might be very good in these specific areas, but for everything else, they're going to be relying on third parties. And just like in the previous case, allied agencies play a key role. The only difference in this stage is that there is a form of exchange. So a bigger agency might use some of the expertise of the smaller agency in return of either tooling expertise, knowledge, or raw intelligence. Finally, we have what most of us are familiar with because of the amount of information that's out there, which is large countries with hundreds or thousands of people dedicated to cyber signals intelligence, with global presence, typically with centers in multiple parts of their countries and in some cases even in remote countries, to have 24/7 coverage for all of the operations. Those organizations, as you can imagine, they are so big that they have varying technical expertise. They might have areas of the agency where they have extremely technically capable people, and other areas where people are not so competent. But because of the size of those organizations, they tend to be very bureaucratic, which means you have multiple layers of management, you have different organizations duplicating work of other organizations because there is miscommunication due to the amount of abstraction layers in between, and so on. So this is a disadvantage since those organizations tend to be a little bit slower on how they operate. Typically, because of their size and their capabilities, they are building a lot of things in-house, and there is a bias towards insourcing. And this has a logic behind it, since those organizations cannot reach out and get a lot of their needs from what is available by third parties. Of course, they have some sort of collaboration, but it is a different kind of collaboration. They typically have much smaller amount of countries that they are very closely collaborating with, and a way larger amount of countries that they are acting as a service provider. Now, in terms of people in those organizations, you can easily probably imagine this. A lot of people see that as a normal job, so there is nothing special to it. Other people love it, and some people don't like it. This reflects also to the way they work. So you could see that certain people are far more engaged and they are doing really innovative work, while others are doing a playbook like step by step. Like any other organization, whether in the private or public sector, there is some form of performance evaluation, which means people are not focused always on how to get the best thing out there, but how to do the best for their performance evaluation. This depends from one agency to another, but it's something that you need to consider. And all of the organizations have some form of KPIs. It could be as simple as how many tickets did you fulfill from the collections that you requested to do, all the way to did you manage to compromise any of our technology because of the operations you executed. So there are many different ways that people are getting measured. But the most important part you have to remember is the last one, that each agency has its own culture, which means some agencies might be very bureaucratic, very top-down, and very structured, while others might be more like a startup company on how they operate. And that also reflects on the way they are doing cyber operations, and all of us as defenders, the way we see them when they are attacking different networks. The last part that I have from this introduction is this one, which is how those organizations are structured. Typically, you have one part of the agency which is responsible for all of the incoming requests. You are talking about people that are like liaison officers in other agencies, other people that are receiving all of the incoming RFIs, the requests for information, and so on. This is the, let's say, ingestion for the intelligence requirements. What do the customer need from this agency? The largest part by far in most organizations is the analysis and production. This is where you have all of your intelligence analysts that their whole job is to fulfill those priority intelligence requirements. They are sitting there, they have a variety of different tools that give them access to all of the intelligence, the raw intelligence that is being collected, and they are putting all of that together using various analytic techniques to produce the intelligence products. But to do that, they also need the collection. And here I used also the word that NSA used to use for this department, which is data acquisition. Here you have the collectors, the people that go out and collect the intelligence that is needed by the analysts. Of course, we have the strategy and leadership who is leading this whole organization. And finally, a very important aspect of any intelligence agency, not just signals intelligence, like in general, is legal and compliance. Every single country has usually a whole legal framework around those agencies and how they operate, which means a lot of the operations and general day-to-day work that is being done in those agencies have to be carefully studied and vetted to see if it fits into this legal framework. The most important part for our case is the analysis and production and collection, and more importantly, the collection. The collection has two sides. As I mentioned previously, there are some standing intelligence requirements, things that you know you have to collect. And in this case, it is pretty simple that we need to have this data, we go out, collect them, and get them to the analysts so they can get their job done. But then, imagine that you are an analyst, you are trying to fulfill a PIR, and you realize you're missing some information. Then what do? Is you go and create a task. This is called tasking, and it might be like, I was looking for X, but we don't have it. Here is a task to find and collect it. This is the second part of the collection, which is tasking. The first is, you have those requirements, you know where to find them, you go and fetch them. The second is, I have an intelligence gap, please go out and fill it. Now, there are a couple of different ways that the collection could be done. One is through the automated bulk collection. For example, at the moment, I think there is not even a single country that doesn't have something similar to what it was released like 10 years ago with PRISM of the NSA. Every single country that I'm aware of has a program where their country's intelligence agency has hardware inside of the country's ISPs that they can use to monitor traffic. This is an automated bulk collection. They can enable it at any time they want. They can collect as much information as they are legally allowed to do. The second part is that a lot of countries are operating botnets. Like last summer in a Black Hat, BlackBerry Threat Intelligence revealed that the Linux XOR botnet is actually operated by Chinese nation-state actors. And China is not the only country that operates a botnet. And that is the automated part. That is continuously running. It is a continuous effort by the collection teams to keep that up to date, to maintain it, and have this flow of information. Then we have the tailored access, which is some information that it is only available in a very specific source, and you need some sort of targeted, tailored access to get there. And again, there are many examples of that, like most of the really impressive cyber espionage operations that we see in the news and in threat research fall into that space. And then we have a very interesting space that I'm going to be talking about later, which is the fourth party collection, and I have a whole section about it later on. Okay, so now that we have all a good idea how those organizations are typically structured, how they operate, and their general approaches, let's see what happens when threat research is released. Whether this is a threat report or let's say some zero-day that is being leaked, what happens? And it won't be surprising to anyone, hopefully. The first thing that happens is a retrospective. Why did this happen? What can we learn from it? The retrospective results into lessons learned and in some cases into counterintelligence operations. Let me give you some concrete examples here. I will start with the first two parts, the retrospective and lessons learned. If you remember, in WikiLeaks, there was a major leak a couple of years ago from the CIA called the Vault 7. What I'm going to be picking up from there is one of their Confluence wiki pages. Inside the CIA, you have a few different directorates, and one of them is the DI, the Digital Innovation. In the Digital Innovation, we have the Information Operations Center, or IOC. In there, we have an engineering department that they are building a lot of hacking tools that they are known as the EDG, or Engineering Development Group. And in that Engineering Development Group, there is a small group of very senior developers, engineers, and some of the leadership, which is called TAC, or TAC, which is the Technical Advisory Council. And as you can imagine, the TAC is responsible for exactly that, providing technical advices. Now, in the WikiLeaks content, there was a very interesting case, and it was this one. If you remember, in 2015, Kaspersky Labs created a very detailed report about the equation group that included a lot of the tools that they were using, how those tools were related to each other, and more or less the equation group as a threat actor. Now, this is a screenshot from this internal wiki page that was leaked by WikiLeaks. And what do we read over here is, what did equation do wrong and how can we avoid doing the same? In there are very interesting comments, and how the wiki is structured in WikiLeaks is that you have a user and then a number of each user. So those are different employees of the Technical Advisory Council and the ETG of the CIA that are discussing the results of the retrospective, and they documenting them in a wiki page. In there we read a few different things. For example, one of the identified issues was that they were using a customized crypto that was allowing Kaspersky Labs to easily detect them through different tooling that they were deploying. And the proposed solution from TAC was to use available crypto like Microsoft's libraries, OpenSSL, PolarSSL, and so on. Another finding that TAC had in their lessons learned was the unique mutexes being used. And their proposal was to change their compiling to issue a warning anytime such a mutex is generated, and record those mutexes so they can know which mutex was used in which operation. So the next time some threat research is published, they can quickly go back and see which operation might be compromised. The same with the PDP strings that they were hard-coded in the binaries, and TAC had a very interesting suggestion here, which is to create a scanner that will be looking for those and cross-correlating them with internal sources such as Active Directory for usernames and other information. The most important issue that I want to highlight is the last one, which is the reuse of exploits. And the reason why I want to highlight this one is because of what you might be hearing as the IC, the intelligence community. Every single country, no matter how small or big it is, it's going to have some form of intelligence community. When we are talking about large countries like the United States, officially there are 17 intelligence agencies in the intelligence community, and that is even bigger, as you can probably imagine. All of this is called the community because those agencies are sharing different technologies and expertise and information between them. One of that is exploits. Again, using that information from WikiLeaks, we can find this in a wiki page. This is a subset of the iOS exploits that the US intelligence community had available at the time of that leak. And what I want you to pay extra attention at is this column over here. It says found by. Here we can see that some of them were found by US organizations like the NSA, the FBI's Remote Operations Unit, the CIA. Some of them were purchased by some of the third parties I mentioned earlier, companies that are building and offering those to governments. But there are also some from foreign intelligence agencies like the GCHQ in this case, which is one of the bigger allies of the United States. For us as defenders, this is critical information. Because you saw an exploit being used in an operation by threat actor A, it doesn't mean that this is the only threat actor that had access to it or that it was the threat actor that discovered it. But let me go into a little bit more detail in this topic. If we look into the comments of this thread in this wiki page about the retrospective of the equation group, we can learn more about how those organizations work when there is a leak like that in a threat research. Here we read that the custom crypto is more of NSA failing to its own internal policies and standards, which came about in response to prior problems. And we read that in the past, there were crypto issues where people used zero initialization vectors and other misconfiguration. As a result, the NSA crypto guys blessed one library as the correct implementation, and everyone was told to use that. Now, as a defender and especially as a threat researcher, this is very useful to know, since you might see a very advanced new malware that is still using one library that doesn't make any sense, but that library is also used in another malware from the same threat actor. And that could be your connecting link between the two of them. And the reason could be as simple as this one. It could be literally a policy or a standard of that organization that everyone must use this specific library. Of course, this is not the only case, but it's a nice example to keep in mind. Another very interesting comment is this one, especially the second sentence of this comment. It says, the shared code appears to be the largest single factor is allowing Kaspersky Labs to tie all of these tools together. The acquisition and use of command control domains was probably number 2 on the list. And I'm sure the COG infrastructure people are paying attention to this. Here we have another comment which is about the reuse of code. And again, some of it might be because of some standard or a policy, and some of that could be because that code was available. And again, think about like this, you are a developer in a larger organization, you might have complete different departments dealing with one area, like let's say protocol communication or encryption or authentication, and you just reuse that code to your own library. And if we are talking about a large intelligence community, you might have multiple agencies reusing parts of this code. And as a threat researcher, this is a very useful component to start attributing all of these activities to a single nation. Of course, to narrow it down from a nation to a specific agency, it's a whole new level of attribution that requires different kinds of techniques. Now, another very interesting comment is this one. I'm quite sure that a lot of people, and I also did it for some time, were referring to the equation group as the NSA. But here we read, actually from people working in the US intelligence community, in the CIA in this case, that the way I was looking at it, the equation group isn't the single group Kaspersky imagines it to be. So basically, it is the tools that seem to make the compassing group. And that follows up also in another comment from the same user that happened a little bit earlier that provides us a better understanding of that. It says, the equation group, as labeled in the report, does not relate to a specific group, but rather a collection of tools, mostly from the NSA's Tailored Access Operations and the CIA's Information Operations Center. So basically, the attribution that we had from Kaspersky Labs as the equation group being a single threat actor translates to the US intelligence community as a whole, with more focus on the cyber units of the CIA and the NSA. And this is fully understandable, since it is very hard to differentiate when you have such strong collaboration between intelligence agencies. Hopefully that gives you an idea of what's going on in an intelligence agency when you have threat research being published or being leaked. But I also mentioned about counterintelligence operations. And let's take a few examples over here. I guess all of us are familiar with this one. That's one of the diagrams that FireEye released for the SolarWinds operation that happened at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021. And do you remember some of the top targets of this threat actor? If you don't, I will name a few. One of them was FireEye, another one was CrowdStrike, another was Palo Alto Networks, another one was Malwarebytes, Microsoft, Cisco Security. And in all of those cases, what was the adversary after? They were after threat research and tooling that those organizations were using. This means that they had an intelligence requirement, or they might just be executing a counterintelligence operation, which means, what do all of these companies know about us? What is the information that they have? And this is not surprising. If we go a little bit further back in 2015, we have this case, which is known as the Dooku 2.0 from Kaspersky Labs, which again a nation-state actor infiltrated Kaspersky Lab purely to steal threat research. And if we go even more closely, like recently, the last couple of weeks, that could happen actually the last month and even earlier this month, released by Google's Threat Analysis Group, which is North Korean threat actors targeting threat researchers, specifically in this case exploit developers and vulnerability researchers, to obtain some of the 0 days that they might not have. And those are not the only cases. In one of his interviews in 2019, Edward Snowden stated that the way NSA was working when he was at the NSA was that they were buying any sort of threat research that was available to them, and that wasn't available to them, they were stealing it. So this is what some of these organizations might also be doing. And that could be a clear sign of a counterintelligence operation to find out what the threat researchers know about them. Now I'm moving to the second section of my presentation, the attribution. I mentioned that the attribution for a nation state is not as simple as any cybersecurity organization that might not have to defend it in a national level. And why is this the case? Let's pick up some real cases that happened in the last couple of years. Some of you might remember this one. That was when Turla APT group, which is known as a Russian APT group, probably associated with the FSB, hacked into one of the Iran's APT group's infrastructure, a command control server that is attributed to the APT-34, and used it to infect the machines that were connected to the command control server with the Turla's APT implants. That sounded initially quite impressive, but really it is not something unusual, and I'm going to be talking about it more in this section. But this is not the only case why attribution is hard. Think about this case, and this is just another example from Intel 471, a public post that they made last year, where they have clear links of North Korea threat actors being in collaboration with Russian-speaking cyber criminals for a quite simple reason. Let's say, for example, that a cybercrime group that operates a malware, like let's say TrickBot, Emotet, like it doesn't matter. They have access to one of the targets that you want to get access. If your legal framework allows it, why waste all of this time to infiltrate the target instead of just buying the access that someone already has? Now, us as defenders, when we see a commodity malware infection, we might not treat it as nation-state infiltration, but as we see over here, it could clearly be a nation-state infiltration. Let's complicate the matters even more. Do you remember this one from 2019? This is a blog post from FireEye saying that APT-41 has a dual espionage and cybercrime operation. And specifically, this APT group from China has been observed in multiple occasions doing this kind of work. Like in the normal office hours, the operators are doing what the Chinese nation state wants them to do, and after their work, they use the same knowledge, skills, and in some cases even the tooling for cybercrime operations. So where do you draw the line? Where can you attribute what is which nation? Okay, let me talk a little bit about this case about the fourth party collection, or what Terla APT group did with APT-34 in 2017. In 2015, Der Spiegel leaked a slide deck from the NSA talking about exactly this technique, and the slide deck was from 2011. So literally here we are talking about a technique that is known in nation-state actors for at least 10 years. It is called the fourth party collection, and it goes like this. The first part is the passive collection. This is a screenshot from the slide deck, so think about it, this came from the NSA, so the US is marked in green color on the left. What we see here is that some foreign government managed to infiltrate into some systems, which is the systems you see on the bottom, the foreign computer network exploitation victims, and they are infected with malware that talks to the command and control server. In between, of course, there is a proxying layer to hide the real command and control. What the NSA said over here is that the first step is the passive acquisition, which means at the network tab between that middle layer and the command and control. And what the NSA did at that stage is monitor what is being exfiltrated. And if that is something of interest, then you can move to the next stage. And the next stage is the active acquisition. This is the exploitation of that middle layer and maybe even the command and control layer, so you can have full control of what goes through those channels and either divert it or steal what might be interesting to you to cover your intelligence requirements. But that goes a bit further. We're only talking, okay, we move from passive acquisition to active acquisition. The next one is victim stealing or sharing. And what happens here is that exactly what we read that Terla APT group did in 2017. That is, since you have access to the command and control server or the intermediate proxying layer, you can either use the already infected devices to issue some commands. Let's say, for example, that they have a malware that allows command execution. You can say, okay, that infected system also has this file that are interested to my agency. Let me request that and get those files to my agency. Or you could use it to deploy your own implant in there, which is exactly what Terla Group did with APT34's infrastructure in 2017. They deployed their own implant. Again, this is something from 2011, and why I want to highlight it here is that when you are working in such an agency and your whole job is data acquisition, as the NSA calls it, or data collection, your brainstorming will be around topics like this one. How can you get information without being detected by hiding as much of your activity as possible? And of course, the last step of this collection is the repurposing. And if I remember correctly, what the NSA did in this case, it was that they exfiltrated the exploits and the malware that an Iranian nation-state actor was using, they reverse engineered it, and then they built their own version of it so that they can use it in their own cyber operations. That is also very useful for threat research, since a lot of times you might see a variant of a known malware, and if you study it carefully, you can start realizing that this is a reverse engineered product. This is a product that resulted from another malware that someone took, reverse engineered, adjusted to their needs, and released it to the wild. So if this is so complex and there are so many ways to hide your presence, how can you actually do attribution? And once again, I will be using some leaked information here. In 2016, Reality Winner, a former NSA employee, leaked this slide deck to the press. This is a slide deck that shows an operation from the GRU, the Russian Military Intelligence Agency, against the US government. But what is important for us in this talk over here is how did the NSA manage to attribute this attack to the GRU, and what can we learn from it? So I will take a small snapshot of this very detailed diagram and let's see how they did it. So the legend you can see on the bottom, it is pretty self-explanatory, and we only have a small part of the whole diagram, which is the adversary space and the neutral space. And here we have the operators that registered with a personal cell phone one account, and that was a Gmail account in this case. And then they sent a test email to their personal account. Then they connected to a system which the NSA refers to as the ORB, Operational Relay Box, and from there they started using those email addresses to deliver the spear phishing campaign. Using this information, the NSA was able to link it with a cyber organization within the GRU, or the General Staff Main Intelligence Directorate of Russia. There is also a quick description that it is unknown if the GRU was able to successfully compromise any of the entities targeted as part of this campaign, while this, the name of the unit, cyber espionage program, utilized some techniques that were similar to other Russian GRU cyber operations units. This activity demonstrated several characteristics that distinguish it from another major GRU spear phishing program known as, and then the name of the program. Now, what is this telling us? It is telling us that the NSA had access to the Gmail accounts that were used for the spear phishing campaign, which is reasonable to think, and or they had access to passive network collection, and by that I mean network tabs where they could see the traffic that we see displayed over here. And of course, they had a way to map that the phone numbers that were linked to the email accounts, they were linked to a GRU operator. And you might be thinking, whoa, that is impossible for me as a threat researcher to have this kind of access, this kind of information, but I beg to differ over here. Because if you are defending a network, you most likely have most of these components, and you might be thinking, yeah, but I don't have like a full inventory of GRU operators' phone numbers to cross-correlate if this phone number that they have seen in an attack is related to an actual nation-state actor. And the truth is that there is so much data being released every day from data breaches, from leaked information, from misconfigurations, that using some simple OSINT techniques, you might be able to build some of these capabilities for your organization. And eventually, it is not that hard to do these kinds of correlations. The most important factor in this one is the timing. That the NSA was able to bind this activity with the time that the spear phishing campaign was being executed. And this is how they could tie that, okay, the only operator that had access to this infrastructure at that point was the GRU, so it has to be the GRU that did this operation. As it was shown in previous examples, nation-state actors are in this continuous spy versus spy trying to take over one's command and control infrastructure. So when you're doing attribution, you have to consider the timing, and you also have to consider other factors. Infrastructure itself doesn't say anything. You have to consider who was operating this infrastructure. And with that, I will move to a more recent example. In January 5th, as you probably know, the US government was kind of forced to make a statement around the SolarWinds case. And for this reason, there was this joint statement that was released to the public by multiple agencies, including the FBI, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, and the NSA, with the most important part for our talk being this one. They state likely Russian in origin. And now you probably understand why they didn't say anything more strong, like it was this unit from Russia or it was Russian activity, and they say likely Russian activity. Because as we know today, the US intelligence community was getting forced to make a statement, and probably they didn't have enough evidence to be certain about it at that stage. There were some strong indications, and some of them we also know today, like for example, there were some code reviews between that and Terla APT group, but it is not sufficient to make an absolute statement that, yeah, it was definitely some Russian APT group. And this is why we see this statement that I think a lot of people were making fun when it was released, the likely Russian in origin. So, for a lot of people, attribution can be answered with this question. Who had access to the infrastructure at the time of the cyber operation? But as it was shown over here, if you are a nation-state intelligence agency doing cyber SIGINT, this is not sufficient. What you want is who was operating this infrastructure to execute this cyber operation. And with that, I will close this presentation with some key takeaways that we can take from this. The first one being that nation-state actors are just people doing a job with specific objectives and performance goals. That means that you might get everything from the very, very engaged people that will go the extra mile to the people that will do the bare minimum just to keep their job. That also reflects to what we see as defenders when we see those cyber operators acting inside our networks. The second part is the intention. It is very hard to understand why you might be targeted. And the best tip that I can give you is keeping a close eye on geopolitical developments. What do I mean by this one? As I explained in the beginning, all of those agencies do not collect information just to collect information. They collect them because they have some priority intelligence requirements that they have to fulfill. They have analysts that ask for this information, or they need this information to perform their analysis. For this reason, if you see suddenly a country taking an adversarial step towards another country, you should be expecting that that also reflects to their cyber operations. The same with your organization. If your organization holds information that could be valuable for a country that suddenly has interest in this specific adversary, then your company might be part of the target list. The third part is that infrastructure of an APT doesn't mean that the same APT executed the operation or that they were interested in you. It could be that you were targeted to be used as an auxiliary, let's say as an open redirection, as a proxy, to hide some command control activity or something like that, to send some spear phishing. Or it could be that this command control infrastructure was once owned by APT A, but then APT B took it over, and this is when they attacked you. So although, let's say, you might have some reports that they say that this infrastructure was attributed to APT A, in your case it might be slightly different. Don't make quick judgments on that based purely on the infrastructure. Actually, the diamond model, if you are familiar with it, it was developed to remove that bias, because people were making a lot of decisions based on very specific areas around the malware being used or the infrastructure being used. The last part is that APT groups do most of their collections in bulk automated fashion, Yet almost all of the research that we do focuses on tailored, targeted access. And I get it, usually tailored and targeted access is far more interesting since it has to be very tuned, it requires a lot of manual steps. Sometimes it uses very specialized implants and exploits that are developed explicitly for this operation. But if we really want to protect our organizations, we have to think about the bulk collection. And what I mean by this one is that most of the countries that I have researched on, including some of the medium size and smaller size, they are preferring to go after a large telecommunication provider and siphon all of the traffic, or hack into routers, into a mobile phone operator, generally go for a much bigger collection, like for example what China did with building a botnet, compared to going for specific access to one company or to one person. Of course, both are happening, and tailored and targeted access is usually far more interesting to research on, but maybe we should also start looking into the more automated collection and how we can stop this. The last point that I have is that attribution is hard. Hopefully that was one of the highlights of this talk, that even for nation-state actors with all of the access that they have, it is still hard to do proper attribution. And for that reason, we have to be thinking very critically before we publish something. As it is a general good principle in intelligence reporting, we have to be very clear about what we know, what we don't know, and what is our assessment. And those three things have to be very distinct. So when someone reads it, they can understand that, okay, this threat researcher believes that this was X nation state for this and this reason, but if they had also this information, they could have really higher confidence, but they don't have this information. And with that, I'm closing this talk. So thanks a lot everyone for attending. Here are some contact details if you want to reach out to me. And yeah, if you have any questions, now is the time. Thank you.